Hello again. I want to talk today about something which has been mentioned in the comments here an awful lot. This is the dancing Israelis motif. Essentially, the idea is that the attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon in 2001 were a false flag operation by Israel, the aim being to lure the United States into a war against Iraq and to get them further involved in the Middle East than they already were. Israeli secret agents, though, gave the game away by dancing and celebrating the attacks in New Jersey while they were actually taking place. Bit careless of the Mossad there. I want to begin by making one or two preliminary observations before looking at what is actually alleged to have happened. The first thing I need to say is that young men frequently behave like idiots and are often callous in the extreme. I doubt that anybody will contradict this assertion. It's why they make such good soldiers, because they will take mad risks and many of them do not care whom they hurt or even kill. This is the nature of young men the world over. I want now to consider another point, which is connected with the first. When explosions, fires or bombing raids take place, there will often be found callous young men who treat the event like some public entertainment. This phenomenon is well known to the police and fire brigade. When a disaster strikes, you will find young men who appear excited to see the chaos and destruction. Not all young men, of course, but enough to make this a recognisable thing, and there's usually enough of them to get in the way of the emergency services when something terrible happens. Here are two anecdotes which illustrate this point. During the German bombing raids on London during the Second World War, which we know now as the Blitz, only a minority of people took shelter. This is contrary to the popular view of the matter where everyone was huddled in tube stations and Anderson shelters. 60% of the people in London didn't go to any air raid shelter during raids. They simply walked the streets or stayed in their homes as usual. A lot of younger men thought the whole thing very entertaining and stood in the streets cheering and laughing as though they were at a fireworks display. This was shocking to older people, for these young men were just as likely to cheer if a building blew up as they were if a German plane was shot down. Here's an extract from a book of mine about the British experience of bombing during the Second World War, Secret Casualties of World War II, available from all good booksellers. Let me just read out a little about this particular phenomenon. Even at the height of the Blitz, there were queues outside cinemas, and many ordinary men, women and children carried on their lives with no regard at all for the falling bombs and artillery shells. By 1943, this disregard had changed, and far from being something to endure, air raids had become almost spectacles to be enjoyed, a little like firework displays or football matches. A woman called Vera Hodgson kept a diary in London of what she saw and experienced during the air raids of the Second World War. On the 10th of October 1943, she wrote, "Jolly old whalers set up on Thursday night. This time it was the goods. Gunfire loud and frequent. Searchlights filled the sky and planes caught in them. Lots of people watching. Ladbroke square gun cracking out. Donned my tin hat, courage returned, and I joined the sightseers. All London was doing the same." And actually there were so many crowds that people were being killed by the anti-aircraft shells that fell down. The Home Secretary made a statement in Parliament about this very thing, saying, "I cannot too strongly emphasise that the public, unless their duties otherwise require, should not neglect the warnings so often given not to remain unnecessarily in an exposed position during an air raid." It was happening a lot all over London. This is one instance of what I'm talking about. Here is another. In August 1972, I was in Belfast. Bombs were going off every day at that time. It was just after Operation Motorman when the no-go areas were cleared out by the army. I have to say, a lot of young men found it all very exciting. There was nothing political about it. These are just callous young idiots of the kind about whom I've been talking. The Ferodo company, which makes brakes for cars, had a small factory in Belfast at that time, and the IRA blew it up. The bomb made a terrific noise, and a lot of people rushed to see what the damage was like. This was in the middle of the day. I was in the crowd, which consisted a mixture of ordinary people like housewives out shopping, and also a lot of loafers and young men. It was guessed that another bomb would probably go off soon after the first, which was a particular tactic of the IRA. While we were standing there was a tremendous crash like a clap of thunder, and the car showroom was completely destroyed in the blast. A lot of the young men in the crowd cheered and hooted as though they were at a football match, going, "Way!" like that. Older people, of course, pursed their lips disapprovingly and shook their heads. So far, so good. When the first aeroplane crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center on the morning of September the 11th, 2001, people all across New York were, of course, shocked and horrified. They didn't know what had happened, but nevertheless they stared out their windows at the scene. When the second plane struck, it was clear that this was an attack. One woman in New Jersey was watching with binoculars from her window when she noticed with disgust that some young men were sitting on the roof of a van in a nearby car park. They didn't seem shocked at all, but rather excited. They were fooling around as well, taking pictures of each other against the backdrop of the burning towers. She could hear their voices and said that what she heard sounded like cries of joy and mockery. Quite rightly, she called the police. We pause at this point to remember that these men were not dancing. Dancing on the roof of your employer's van is like to leave dents and create annoyance on the part of your boss. This van belonged to a removal company that these young men worked for. The dancing idea was something which Donald Trump came up with when he was running for president. He claimed that many Muslims in New York had been dancing with joy at the attacks. The idea of the dancing then became mixed up in some people's minds with the men on top of the parked van. I will mention now that I can picture only too readily the scene on top of the van that day. I'm sure that most people will know by now that the men on and around that van were Israelis. I'm pretty sure too that they were Sephardim, probably from families with Moroccan or Tunisian heritage. I'll explain later why I think this. I can even imagine what they would be saying and how they would be acting. I can just see it in my mind. Rafi, Tmona Barakasha, hey, it's easy, Yoffi, and so on. It's an awful vision to have, but still. At any rate, the police were suspicious and ran the white van to earth, finding that it contained a bunch of Israelis who had overstayed their time in America without bothering to go through the formalities of applying for work permits or green cards or anything of that sort. There was also a lot of cash in the back of the van, and the men were anything but cooperative. They were to spend the next couple of months in prison, ostensibly for immigration offences, but really, of course, to see if they might have had anything at all to do with the 9/11 attacks. Their story was that they worked for a removal company, but after the police started asking questions of the owner of the company, he abandoned everything and went to live in Israel, which looked a little suspicious, to say the least of it. The FBI had a very strong suspicion that some of the young men were connected with the Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service, although they were unable to prove it. How likely is this? The Mossad, in addition to the proper agents in the field that they run, have many helpers, gophers, stringers and so on. Some of these might be paid expenses or get the occasional handout, Others simply do things because they are Jews and Israel asks them to. The ones who do stuff for the sake of it for Israel are called Sionim. I knew people engaged in this way a long time ago. For instance, when Brezhnev was in charge in Russia, the Jews there had a pretty raw deal. Some people might remember the refuseniks and so on. The Mossad asked Swedish Jews in Gothenburg to take holidays in Leningrad and bring back verbal messages from people whom they would be directed to meet there. That's the kind of stuff that Sionim do. Then too there were Bodlim. These are Israelis who are gophers for the Mossad, often in exchange for somewhere to stay. They stay in safe houses and so on when they're not being used. Sometimes they get bits of money and so on. I'm guessing that at least 2 or 3 of those young men picked up in that van were Bodlim. Israel was at that time collecting information about charities in America which were funding Hamas, Muslim charities that is. Some regular Mossad people were involved in these investigations, but they also used stringers, and these young men would have been ideal. This is why I guess that they were Sephardim rather than Ashkenazi. A lot of people from those families speak Arabic as easily as they do Hebrew. Their grandparents grew up in Arab countries before they made Aliyah. Arabic is a home language. It's not hard to guess that some of these young men were Bodlim. Why were they behaving so stupidly on the day of the attacks? Partly because that is, as I said, what many young men do when they see scenes of destruction of that kind. There might also have been an element of schadenfreude. Israel has had to put up with such things for years, and they might have thought this event would bring it home to America, just what they had had to endure for so many years. Did Israel plan the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon? Ask yourself this. If you were carrying out a dreadful atrocity against a supposed ally, would you then start gloating and drawing attention to yourself in the way that those guys in New Jersey did? Just think, the Mossad has pulled off the most momentous false flag operation in the history of the world, and it's something likely to change the geopolitical balance of the Middle East. Would they really employ idiots like that who would give the game away the same day that the thing happens? I can't imagine any secret service being so careless, let alone the Mossad. I am of course well aware that some will dismiss this as disinformatia on behalf of the Israelis, but this is really nothing of the kind, just a little speculation about a subject which I've seen mentioned quite a few times lately.